For those that were with us last night with the 20s and 30-something Shabbat dinner, I'm sorry this is a little bit redundant and repetitive. I just got back from spending a month in Israel over 3 days. That's certainly how it felt. I was there actually for a week. The first half of it was quite chill. Got to spend some quality time with my daughter, and then on the business side of it, she was a +1, so I really got to spend the whole week with her. The first part was just really the two of us and some very good friends, which was lovely. This is my second trip to Israel since the war began. My first trip was in November, about 3 or 4 weeks after the war began, and this one obviously just last week, now 4 months into it. I can tell you that things have definitely changed, and they've improved somewhat, but I was sharing with Talia during the Haftarah, because it was a very long Haftarah. So I was sharing with Talia during the Haftarah that the way in which I understand the change, or at least noticed it, is that in November, all of Israel was still in shock. They were still in shock. And when you're in shock, you're just kind of, you're not really understanding what's happening around you. They knew that they had to right away get into a war, and the goals of releasing the hostages and dismantling Hamas, 1,000% agreement on, but there was still very much a sense of shock, a depression, a heaviness, a sadness, a disbelief, an uncertainty about the future in every way, shape, or form. What I learned this time is that Israel is not so much in shock, but still very much in the midst of trauma. It's not PTSD, because they're nowhere near that yet. They're still in the in the trauma of it, and they're still trying to figure things out. And no one's really has had the space, the emotional, the spiritual, even the physical space, to really start unwrapping and unraveling and trying to understand what is that happened and what the implications of it are long term. Short term, people's attention is focused first and foremost on the release of the hostages, and secondly, restoring the sense of safety so that Israelis, there's about 300,000 Israelis that are displaced from the south and from the north, but to restore the sense of safety so that Israelis can go back to their homes and not be worried that they are going to be overcome by a genocidal terrorist organization that only wants to kill them. And one of the things I learned on this trip is how profound the sense of unsafety is amongst Israelis. Israelis used to believe, and perhaps naively so, that the defenses they put up were sufficient. That they couldn't imagine that Hamas would ever have the capability or the organizational know-how to pull off an attack such as they did. And they also couldn't imagine that Hamas would have done it even if they could have the capability to do it, because surely they must know what the Israeli response would be for such an attack. The worst the Israelis could have imagined was that maybe, somewhere between 10 and 100 terrorists would come and they would hold one community along the border for some length of time, but they wouldn't be able to hold it for that long, because within a matter of a couple of hours, the IDF and the police would mobilize, and they would be there, and that would be the end of it. What they did was send 3,000 terrorists over, and they occupied 22 kibbutzim and villages of southern Israel in what's called the Gaza envelope for about 8 to 12 hours. Some terrorists even managing to evade capture for more than a day. So what happened was just totally out of the realm of imagination of Israel's security establishment, and probably also due to a lot of hubris that technology and a fence would be enough to deter Hamas from doing anything that they would want to do. And Israelis were lulled into a sense of security through Iron Dome and the safe rooms that they built. Iron Dome, after all, is 96% efficient. And you listened in November and also now to people's stories of the day in which the war started. There were rockets. We went to the safe room. We noticed that rockets lasted a little bit longer, so we thought we'd be in the safe room for a few more hours than necessary. But what ended up happening was this attack was so massive, the safe rooms weren't safe. The safe rooms weren't safe. The bomb shelters weren't safe, not because of missile attacks, but because when Hamas terrorists went into people's homes, they lured people out of their safe rooms, or they sent grenades into them, or the safe rooms didn't have locks on them. There was one story I heard of a family in their safe room, and he, the husband, is literally holding the door back from Hamas trying to break into it, entry, and they're shooting guns and they're pushing, and he's doing this. His 4 hours, his wife said, right? 4 hours he's holding this door, protecting his family, and they had one handgun amongst them. And when he realized that he was running out of steam, they all said goodbye to each other because they figured they were all going to die. And the wife picked up the handgun. He collapsed. He was killed. But she managed to kill all 4 of the Hamas terrorists, and she and her children managed to survive. In some ways, that's a lucky story, right? Because she and her children survived. But now take that story and multiply it by 1,200. 1,200 stories of Hamas entering those safe rooms like that, right? So one of the things that I learned, and the reason you have so many Israelis that have been evacuated from the south and from the north is because there is this profound feeling of being unsafe. And the fear from the north, the reason that Israel is responding to Hezbollah, although very strategically trying to prevent another full-out war, but the reason also that 80,000, 100,000 Israelis from the north have been evacuated is because they're afraid that if Israel doesn't dismantle Hamas and restore deterrence, what's to stop Hezbollah from doing the same in the north? It is a terrible, terrible sense of uncertainty and fear that Israelis are having at this moment, right? And part of the reason for that, as I think about the Torah reading this morning, is part of the reason for that is because the covenant between the people and the state was broken on October 7th. Right? In the Torah, the people break the covenant with God and build this Egel HaZahav, a golden calf. And maybe the Egel HaZahav of October 6th was Israel's false idol that the technology was enough to prevent Hamas from crossing the border. And the Egel HaZahav, and the commandments, the brit that was broken, was the security apparatus and the politicians to know better. And there hasn't yet been the investigations, but there's been information that's been leaking out that shows that there were actually signs of what was going on, but that Israeli hubris didn't respond to them, didn't take them seriously. And so we have this Egel al-Zahav, this brit of the social contract between the government and the IDF that and Israelis that has been broken. And so part of what the IDF has to do is reestablish that trust, not only with the press, but has to reestablish it with the Israelis themselves, which by and large they've been doing. One of the people I had the opportunity to meet with was Admiral Daniel Hagari, who's the chief spokesperson for the IDF. And the first thing he said to this group of about 300 leaders, Jewish leaders from around the world, the first thing he said is the IDF failed the Jewish people on October 7th. It's an amazing thing to hear, because we don't hear it all that often. In fact, I don't remember the last time I heard a serious public official take responsibility for their failures. But that's the first thing that he said. And here's something you need to know about Admiral Hagari. He was the commander of the top Israeli Naval SEALs unit. This is not a guy who's used to talking, right? This is a guy who says, the way he says is, I'm used to being underwater in silence. And yet now he's the chief spokesperson for the IDF, and that was the first thing that he said, that the IDF failed. And so part of this mission is reestablishing trust with the Israeli public, which it is doing. I want to say something related to him also about what's in the news these days, especially considering the events that took place on Thursday with this humanitarian aid convoy and the loss of life that took place around it. And I want to start by saying is these matters are extremely complicated. They're extremely complicated. And the conversation about morality regarding them needs to be complicated as well. We have to remember that war is chaotic. And despite the best training that any military could have, people are going to make mistakes. We saw that the IDF made a mistake with the 3 hostages that they could have rescued but ended up shooting. What doesn't get reported unless you're reading the Israeli news are all the Israeli soldiers that have been killed by Israeli fire, by friendly fire, as what it's called, by accident. In war, bad things happen. It's the nature of it, and innocents are going to die because they get caught up in it. Not to make a moral equivalency, but a distinction. There's a distinction between the innocents that died, the Israeli innocents that died at the hands of Hamas, and the Palestinians that are dying in Gaza as a result of the war. And that distinction is about motive and intention. And that's not just semantics, right? These words matter because motive matters. When you go to Kibbutz Be'eri, as I did on this trip, or you go to the site of the Nova Music Festival, where 378 children were slaughtered. And by children, I mean they were adult children in their 20s and 30s. But the Israelis have put a stake in the ground where every Israeli was killed with a picture of that person, and you walk through it. It's a maze of people. And I got to tell you, every face I looked at was the face of my own daughter. Right? My own daughters. and the bomb shelters that were nearby, where people went to when the missiles started, Hamas came and threw grenades into them. Right? Their motive in attacking Israel was not a military motive. It was not to take and hold land. It was, and then to somehow, annex it to Gaza and to create, a greater Palestine. It was not to do that. It was not to destroy Israeli military capability, although they wanted to do that in order to do what their main goal was. But their main goal was to kill, butcher, rape, torment, torture, and take hostage Israelis. That was their goal. That's murder. Taking people, especially children, is a war crime. And every day in which those hostages are captive adds to the war crime. Of course, Hamas isn't a recognized political entity, and so there's no jurisdiction for taking Hamas before the International Criminal Court. But that's what Hamas did. Israel, in its response, is fighting Hamas, not the Palestinian people. And it is a tragedy that Palestinians are being killed as a result of it. But it is not genocide. Words have meaning. It is not genocide. And you know it's not genocide because if it were genocide, there'd be hundreds of thousands of Palestinians at this point that would already be dead. You know it's not genocide because even if you're going to accept the Hamas Health Ministry's estimate of the number of dead as being correct at 30,000, then as Yaakov Katz said a couple weeks ago when he was here, you have to also accept that Israel's estimates of the number of militants that have been killed is 12,000. And if you do the math, then the ratio of combatant to innocent is 1 to 1.7 or 1 to 1.8, 1 to 1.9, meaning that for every Hamas combatant that Israel kills, less than 2 innocents are killed as a result of it. The average in the international arena is 1 to 9. You look at what's happening in Ukraine, you look at what's happening in Myanmar, you look at what happened in Iraq. There has never been a combat circumstance where the ratio of combatant to innocent is as low as what's happening in Gaza in the history of recorded warfare. That's how you know it's not genocide. Facts matter, right? Facts matter. Now, that by no means diminishes the terrible loss of life that the Palestinians are experiencing, the thousands that are injured as a result of this, or the devastation that has been brought upon Gaza in terms of the destruction of its buildings. But my challenge to those who would be armchair ethicists is, how else would you have Israel fight this war? How else would you have them do it when there's 500 kilometers of tunnels underneath every public institution in Gaza? How else would you have them do it? Are Israelis supposed to sacrifice tens of thousands of their lives? That's the moral dilemma. And so when we think about the innocent civilians, we have to remember the larger context in which this war is being fought. And Israel understands, at least the IDF understands, that the goal is to defeat Hamas and to return the hostages. They know you can't defeat an ideology, that the ideology of Hamas is going to continue. And you can see that ideology in the cruelty and the brutality of October 7th and the way in which they use their own people as human shields. and even in their own words, to destroy Israel and the Jews worldwide. Israel, on the other hand, is a people's army. And in order to believe that the Israelis were engaging in genocide, you'd have to believe that your children and your grandchildren and your nieces and your nephews and your friends' children and so forth are capable of doing that. And every Israeli that I met, they just scratched their head and they said, I don't understand how anybody can accuse us of this. Even to the point of when you go to a place like the Nova site and you talk to the security professionals that are there, if this was a war, the mission, the goal in a war is to neutralize the enemy. Once that enemy is down and neutralized, you move on to the next target or the next challenge or so forth and so on. You don't empty the clip of your AK-47 into a person that's already dead. And the Israelis that I met with said, crying, we would never do this. Yes, we know that when we're in battle, when we're wearing the uniform, that we have to kill people in order to defend ourselves and to defend our country. But they couldn't imagine the hate that someone would possess such that even after someone is dead, they would empty the clip of their automatic rifle into a dead human being, let alone all the other things that we read about in terms of the brutality, which I won't mention here at this time. So you would have to accept that people you know and people you care about and our children would do that. And I just don't accept that. Are there crazies in Israel? Yeah, absolutely. Are there people who left to their own devices would do crazy things? Yeah, absolutely. By the way, that's why Ben Gvir and Smotrich weren't allowed in the IDF. And yet they're in the government, which of course complicates Israel's position publicly and diplomatically. But the IDF wouldn't let those two guys in. They did not serve because Ben Gvir, in particular, the IDF, was worried that he would go off. Right? And so we have a problem politically. But in terms of the institution of the IDF, we should be confident that they're doing their job and they're doing it with great professionalism and ethics. Hagari also said that it's important to recognize that on the day after, whatever that would be, which the politicians still haven't made up their mind about, on the day after, what's important here is you have to break the system, you have to break Hamas, so you create the opportunity for something else to grow in Gaza. Two more things, and then I'll close this up, and happy to talk to people during Kiddush. An interesting story that gives me hope, that Saul Singer, who's one of the co-authors of the book The Startup Nation, and a new book that came out before October 7th called The Genius of Israel, The Surprising Resiliency of a Divided Nation in a Turbulent World. Very, very relevant to what's happening right now. He shared with us a story of Israelis and Russians on the beach in Thailand. On October 8th, all the Israelis on the beach were on their phones trying to get back to Israel as quickly as they could, some of which were called up, others were volunteering to be called up. And the Russians were scratching their heads, right? What the hell are you guys doing? We came here to avoid being drafted, and going to war, wearing the uniform. And you guys can't wait to get back. Are you out of your minds? Why were the Israelis so eager to get back? What's the secret of Israeli resiliency, of Jewish resiliency? Well, according to Singer and his analysis in his book, it's because we Jews, when we create societies, we create a society of service. The IDF is a people's army. When you wear the uniform, you are serving your country. And everyone, except for Haredim, and maybe that's going to change too, has to do it. Or you have to do a shnat Sherut, a year of service. Talia's here from Israel doing a year of service for the Jewish people, as is Nidan. You have to do a year of service. We have a mission going to Israel to volunteer because we have people in our own congregation that want to go and do something. They want to serve the Jewish people. They want to serve Israel. And when Israel's where Israel's government failed in the days after October 7th, before and after, civil society is picking up the slack. What gives me hope is the Jewish people themselves and the way in which Israelis of all stripes have been united around this issue and the way that we in the diaspora have been united around it as well. What also gives me hope, quite frankly, is that there are people who are beginning to process what all of this means. I met with my friend Avi Meir, who used to be he's the immediate past editor of the Jerusalem Post. Our group, when they go to Israel in the end of March, is going to meet with him. And I asked him, I said, how do you deal with this? What's the future? If anything, it seems to me that October 7th has proven that you can't ignore the Palestinians. But if you go straight to statehood as a result of this attack, then aren't you rewarding terrorism? And he and I had a very long conversation about it, and he phrased the challenge this way, which is it's an incredible challenge, but the fact that there's someone able to phrase it in this way gives me hope. He says that what October 7th demonstrated to Israelis is that a Palestinian state is at the same time an existential threat and an existential necessity. Right? It's a threat and a necessity. The challenge is, how do you create the policies and the procedures and the process that allows you to, in the short term, deal with the threat and simultaneously create a pathway in the long term that will lead to a necessity? That's a tremendous challenge. And if I had an answer to that, I'd probably win a Nobel Prize. But I don't. But we, Jews, we are a people of questions, because we know that when we learn to ask the right questions, together we can find the right responses. So being able to phrase that question in that way gives me hope that perhaps we can find a right response. To bring this all together again to the Torah reading, you have the Egel HaZahav, this idolatrous golden calf that represented the breaking of the contract between the Israelites and God. And we have the Egel HaZahav of October 7th that led to the breaking of a contract between Israelis and their leadership, and Israelis and their sense of hubris in terms of ignoring the Palestinians for far too long. What is fascinating about Moshe's response is not only does he break the commandments that are of God, showing that God does not exist in things or even land, but that God exists in humanity, is also that those broken tablets are holy in and of themselves. And according to one midrash from the Talmud, where do they get placed? The midrash teaches us that Rabbi Yosef taught that both tablets, the tablets of the broken commandments and the tablets of the renewed commandments, get placed in the Aron Kodesh, in the ark, together, side by side. And so we can think of them, therefore, as metaphors for our spiritual lives and for the Jewish people. In the field of psychology, we recognize that each of us carries within ourselves the remnants of our past experiences, the broken fragments of our personal histories. These fragments shape our perceptions influence our behaviors, and color the way in which we engage in the world around us. October 7th represents a set of broken fragments that will color the way in which Israelis and Jews perceive the world around us, the questions that we ask, and the responses that we develop. And the secret is that within this brokenness always lies the potential for growth and transformation. Moshe broke the commandments and then received a renewed set of commandments that, if you read the Torah carefully, are not exactly like the ones before, because they had to respond to the new reality of an Egel HaZahav. And how we move forward from here is not going to be like October 6th. We're going to take these broken pieces, we're going to create a new covenant, not only within Israelis and their own leadership, which is yet to come, but God willing also with Israelis, with Palestinians, and with others in the world. Kenny Ratzon, may it be God's will.